I think it works. Y'all can keep talking. You got 33 seconds. We're just doing a mic test. That's right. Let's give Joey Williams a hand here. That was good. Oh, we can't clap in here. My bad. Sorry about that, Tony. I got a little out of hand. Yeah, I got 19. It's not officially church until like 17. So I can clap. I can even play a guitar real quick. I can't play one of those. You don't want me to. I can do air guitar. Yeah. Ring, ring. All right. All right, my slides are up. That's better. I was concerned I was going to think about New Kids on the Block. Okay, tonight we're going to continue our study. I gave a description of it last week. I'll kind of review that again if you weren't here. We are going to be looking through the New Testament, thinking about it contextually. We will do case studies along the way. Tonight we're going to look at a particular story in the New Testament and look at it from a perspective of, it would be much deeper to understand that if I knew what the situation was around it. Then ultimately we'll do about 6 or 7 weeks of that, and then we're going to move to just looking at Paul's journeys in Acts and interpreting some of the things that happened there in that narrative based on the context that we learned about in the Greek and Roman world. And so there was a lot of stuff thrown at you last week. We'll take it a little bit slower. But tonight we're going to start off with thinking about our second lesson is who's in charge during the New Testament period. When I say New Testament period, I mean the time of the composition of the New Testament. So we are talking about probably from somewhere in about the mid-40s, depending on what your interpretation of when Revelation was written, either to about 64 or all the way out to the mid-90s. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well. But what's important is, the good news is, there's only one group in charge this entire time. It's not like we have to do in the Old Testament, and we're hopping from the Hittites to the Egyptians to the Assyrians to the Babylonians to the Persians. All along the way, we have one group in charge. It's very important that we understand a little bit about that world, because that's the world that Paul is going into in his missionary work. And to some measure, it is the world that Jesus lived in. But things are not the same between Palestine and Asia and Greece and the Roman peninsula, the Italian peninsula where Rome is. Life was different. Lifestyles were different. Different people's roles was different. What Jews believed, what their expectations of Messiah were may have differed depending on where you went. Even though they're one big happy empire, you are definitely talking about a lot of different cultures. And it's wrong for us to assume that people in Rome thought like people in Jerusalem, even if they were Romans. Along those lines. And so we're going to look at the homework I gave you. I gave you Matthew 22, 15 through 22. I hope that you read that for homework. If not, it's not very long. You can read that as I go through this, but I will be giving you homework most every week. It's not going to be lengthy as usual. Usually I have my classes read at least a chapter a week as we're going through, but this we're just going to be isolating some particular things that I just want you to be familiar with as you come to class. But the situation we have here in setting the tone is there is an effort to entrap Jesus between a rock and a hard place by using a particular situation, which was the poll tax that the Romans put on the Jews. It's very important that we understand what was going on there, because this is not a lesson to teach us about paying taxes. There are other places in the New Testament that can deal with that very clearly. But if we understand the political situation and also the religious situation that Jesus is dealing with here, it deepens what Jesus has to say here. And that's what I hope that this course will do for all of you. That some of you may be new to Bible study. Some of you may have been doing Bible study for 60, 70 years like Burka over there. And it's been a long time in the Bible, long in the tooth on that. But hopefully what it does is it enriches your Bible study by getting some of the nuances that allow us to have just a little bit deeper appreciation for what the text is saying. Most of the things that we read in the Gospels are pretty easy to understand from a base level, but hopefully this will help out with that. I gave you in the Synoptic Gospels in Mark 12 and Luke 20, we have parallels to the story. And so when you look through these different descriptions, the antagonists that are confronting Jesus, trying to trap him, are his usual suspects. The Pharisees, it also mentions Herodians and spies. And I'm talking all the way across these three synoptic readings. I tried to kind of look at all of them and gather those things together. So some people coming together to antagonize Jesus, and their motivation is, who are we going to make Jesus an enemy of? Are we going to get him entrapped for sedition and treason by saying you shouldn't pay taxes to Rome, which was a very dangerous thing for someone to say? Or are we going to put Jesus as a friend of Rome and an enemy of the Jewish zealots? The zealots were a sect of Judaism who obviously did not want the Roman hegemony over them, and even to the point of rebelling against them in violent ways. These are the guerrilla warriors of Jerusalem, if you will. So are we going to paint Jesus is he going to be between this terrible position and where he has to make a choice? Now, we know that Jesus outsmarts these people, as he always does, because he knows their intentions and what they are trying to do. But the worst thing he could do is say, don't pay taxes to Rome, and be accused of treason in that way. Most Roman provinces, the Rome did not care really what you did, as long as you provided soldiers for the army, did not rebel against the government, and paid your taxes. Other than that, they're not micromanagers in what they had to look at. They flatter Jesus with this great introduction and say, you don't, show preferential treatment to people. Literally, they said, you don't look at the face of people, meaning you don't judge people based on their face. You're just a pure guy. You're just a great guy, Jesus, coming up and buttering him up in our modern day language. And I almost wish I could see Jesus' smirk on his face by knowing, okay, that's about enough. Kind of like the smirk you see on some of your boss's face when you have that guy that always comes and kisses up to the boss and tries to edge his way in by telling how good the boss's tie looks that day or some other nature of thing. Jesus just listening to this baloney that they are spitting out. But now it's true what they say about Jesus. He's not one that cares about what someone's, and we say their face. It's not necessarily meaning their appearance. The idiom there means what someone looks like or what their status is in life. And indeed, Jesus did not look at those things. The means by which most scholars think that we have an irritating poll tax. In Greek, it would be kensos, a poll tax that was a lot of taxes Rome put on things, and even local taxation that you would have. As you passed through different cities, as you sold your goods, they had a lot of taxes on people. And the Jews didn't necessarily like this tax, but for more than just financial reasons, they disliked this tax. And we're going to see that as we look in that. The background of this is there was rebellions against Rome and slight resistance to him. We look in evidence from Josephus. We know of a guy named Judas, or Judas we can say in English. A certain Galilean whose name was Judas prevailed with his countrymen to revolt and said they were cowards if they would endure to pay a tax to the Romans and would, after God, submit to mortal men as their lords. This man was a teacher of a particular sect of his own and was not at all like the rest of their leaders. And so this kind of describes, in some ways, Jesus. He was a leader of a small group of people, more than 12. I think sometimes we think it was just Jesus and just 12 people. But often we see Jesus and the 12 separating from the other people who were following him around, especially groups of women that followed him around. So we see that in Josephus' War of the Jews, also in his Antiquities. He talks about, yet there was one Judas, a Gaulonite, of a city whose name was Gamala, who was himself a Sadduc, a Pharisee, became zealous to draw them to revolt, who said that taxation was no better than an introduction of slavery and exhorted the nation to exert their liberty. It sounds almost like Patrick Henry in the Constitutional Convention, thinking about being taxed and going through that. The other passage was interesting. We think about submitting to men as their lords, which is very, very important as we think about the context here. Josephus was, we would say, pretty close to a contemporary in time with Jesus. So we're not talking about someone far separate in time. Even over in Acts chapter 5, those of you that remember this story, if not, I'll kind of spell it out. Gamaliel is a very wise Jew, and there's some issues here with wanting to stomp out Peter and John and their teachings in Jerusalem. And Gamaliel comes and says, hey, let's just think about this. I'm paraphrasing, of course. Let's think about this just for a second. These guys are part of a little movement here that's going on, and this is not the first time. And in the past, there's been times that come up, and, they didn't come to anything. It wasn't any big deal. And he says, you know what? If it's not from God, it'll flitter out. But if it's from God, who are we to stand in its way? And he mentions Theudas rose up some time ago. He's given us as an example, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. That's a pretty good posse of people, different, probably more than what Jesus had at the time, or Peter and John had. But he was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and disappeared. After him, Judas the Galilean rose up at the time of the census and got people to follow him. He also perished, and all who followed him were scattered. Just let it play out, is what Gamaliel is saying. So we have different groups of people and individuals who have had time try to kick up a little dust against the Romans. Now, a few decades after Jesus leaves this earth, the Jews really have a strong rebellion against Rome under Emperor Vespasian, and he sends his son Titus, who puts that down with finality, destroying the temple that still lays in ruin till today. In that way. In Greek, he said, is it lawful for us to pay taxes? Or also Jesus says, well, just give back unto Caesar. We have a Greek word, tathime, which is where people get their word tithe today. A tithe does not mean a tenth. Tithe means to give in Greek, to place or to lay something down in Greece. And so are we going to pay that back? Well, when Jesus says it, it sounds like we say, well, it belongs to Caesar, give it back to Caesar. In some ways, that's a very simple teaching in the way I look at it. But this is very politically and religiously charged question to Jesus, and his response was equally politically and religiously charged in that way. This is one of these examples I wanted to show you when translators try to do too much. Now, those of you that have been in my class before know I don't make any doctrinal decisions from an English translation. There is no way I would be irresponsible enough to make a doctrinal decision based on a translation of the Greek New Testament. I make my doctrinal decisions on the Greek New Testament and looking at it. But if I do use, and I do use translations because that makes life a lot easier for teaching, is I look at probably a dozen. And so I look through to see Jesus' response. And in every translation, including the good old New King James Version, who is based on, it's a good English translation, but it's based on an extremely small number of Greek manuscripts, so I don't use it just as my only translation. But even it did a good job of translating the Greek words icon here and epigraphe, which are image and inscription in every translation, but the ones that I found that I looked at. The New Revised Standard Version says, whose head is this and whose title? Well, the second part of that is okay, but head is kephale in Greek. It is not icon. And so this is really not a good translation, especially with the nuance that we're going to talk about. And just a couple of years ago, they came out with an updated edition, and they still had it screwed up. And so I was very disappointed in that. And we see over in the New Living Translation, which I use a lot, in trying to think about how to word things in English where they're understandable, is whose picture and title are stamped on it. Pictures may be a little bit better. The Greek word icon is where we get our word. I'm going to give you 3 guesses. Oh, y'all, I tell you what, it is a pleasure, always a pleasure to be in a room with advanced students in that way. But yeah, an icon is something that represents things, an image, and that is very important. Here we have the coin of Tiberius. And on this coin, in abbreviated Latin, on what would be your left-hand side, it says Tiberius Caesar, divine, august, son of Augustus. Augustus is not an emperor's name, it is his title. And so we have the son of the August and son of Augustus, divine son on that one side. And the other side says Pontifex Maximus. Now, it's abbreviated there. Anybody know what Pontifex Maximus means in Latin? See, this is where you're not so advanced. You've heard this before because it's the title of the head of the Roman Catholic Church right now. High priest. It means high priest or supreme priest. Now let me ask you something. You're a Jew. And let's go back and remember our 10 Commandments just for a minute. You guys got that part down? 10 Commandments. How much do you think a Jew would appreciate carrying around a coin with a man's image claiming to be divine and a high priest? Would that, you think, rub them slightly the wrong way? Is there a commandment that would just really, really like violate? You know, an image, and that's why it's important to think about Jesus' response to them. Whose image is on it? I bet zealots couldn't stand to have this thing in their pocket. Because I don't know about you, but there's not many images in Judaism. We don't have a lot of statues of Moses and other things. If I go down to the West End Synagogue, I'm not going to find a statue of David down in there or some sort of statue of God. I'm sure not going to see some human being claiming to be divinity and a high priest, especially when Rome is their enemy. And so this coin and this tax are more than just financial. I think that there's a lot about this that religiously offends Jews. And now for the claims that Caesar was making, that Tiberius was making. Look, Tiberius is really not that arrogant of an emperor compared to Caligula or Nero along those lines. But to think that they're a son of God's or have divinity, an angle of divinity to it, very common against ancient Near Eastern rulers. And for them to claim that was a political and religious thing along those lines. So when Jesus says that, they say, well, it's Caesar's. Obviously, it's Caesar's. Well, give it back to him and give unto God what is God's. And as usual, Jesus has just completely shut them down. They tried to back him into a corner, and he turned around and backed them into a corner. What are they supposed to say about that at all? And so when we look at something like that, we think about the Roman rule over them, keep in mind there were other things that really rubbed them the wrong way. It's one thing to be underneath another government. It's another to be under a government where the head of that government claims to be deity and then makes you pay a tax with a coin that's got his image on it and him claiming to be the high priest of those people. The Jews had their own high priest. They didn't need him at all. Okay, you ready for the boring part? Now, some of you are like, Tim, that was the boring part right there. Now, this is the boring part. You have to know history to understand and interpret the Bible. I hate to break that to you. I know nobody wants to study history, but you have to know a little bit about the history surrounding the text to be able to properly understand the Bible, or else you're just lost in what's going on. And so I'm going to give you some of this kind of very, very quickly. The origin story of Rome, if you remember, Romulus and Remus, who were nursed by a she-wolf, supposedly in mythology founded the city of Rome, and is around 753 BC. So a very old city, but now this is not the beginning of the Roman Empire. It's nothing more than a city on the Italian peninsula, which is mainly governed by the Latins and the Etruscans and other people along that way. Eventually it becomes a republic. If you've seen the sign that says SPQR, that is what it means in Latin, the Senate and people of Rome. And so it's a republic, very much similar perhaps to what we have with our own government, with elected representatives of a senatorial or equestrian class. And then the emperor is really not even a word in Latin. The emperor is really called the first citizen. So in many ways, it's very similar to what we have in the concept of a president. As the president is supposed to be the representative of the citizenry in our government in that way. Now, I know that don't always seem like that's the case, but that's what his job is to be, is kind of be that person standing there as one of the citizens, primary citizens of the government. So around 509, the latter part of the 6th century, they became the dominant power in the Mediterranean in about 202 when they defeated the Carthaginians. And I am not talking about the people who live up the road here. There's a reason Rome and Carthage are next to each other in Tennessee. They were bitter enemies of each other. And Carthage, who was a city that was originally founded by the Phoenicians, you know some Phoenicians. Jezebel was a Phoenician princess in the Old Testament. They controlled the Mediterranean trade until they were destroyed. You guys may remember Hannibal Barca was defeated in this. Hannibal was the guy that hauled all the elephants over the Alps to attack Italy and ran wild on the Italian peninsula, nearly defeating Rome. Rome finally figured out if we go attack the homeland, Hannibal has to leave and come defend the homeland. And they defended there and became the dominant power in the Mediterranean. Judea is occupied by by General Pompey in about 63 BCE. At this time, and we're talking about the Roman as an empire hasn't yet come to that. Gaius Julius Caesar, who died about 44 BCE, is leading up to this. We ask anybody they know from Rome, at least you know Julius Caesar, right? In that way, and so that was not his first name. In 27 BC, we have the beginnings of empire. This is when Octavian, Julius Caesar's nephew, took power after a little bit of fighting between himself, Mark Antony. You guys know Mark Antony and Cleopatra. You've seen the movie. This is that time frame that we're talking about. Keep in mind, the last Pharaoh of Egypt was a woman, ladies. Big thumbs up on that right there. But she was, I don't know if she's really all that good looking. I've seen some statues of her, and she's kind of pretty ugly. If you know it, but she's pretty politically shrewd. I'll give her that credit. But we have an empire in 27 to the maximum extent in about 117. This is a map of it. I know it's kind of hard to see. It's actually easier for you to see than it is for me to see. But as you can tell, it is difficult to underestimate the power that Rome had. In our modern day world, they would control most of Great Britain and England, Spain, France, a lot of Germany, all of Italy, Switzerland, the Balkans, Greece, all of North Africa, Egypt, the modern day Middle East, Turkey, all the way to probably the border of Syria. And so a gigantic empire, and as you can see, they completely encircle the Mediterranean, control the entrance to the Mediterranean, all Mediterranean trade. And so the power and influence of the Roman Empire has never been equaled in human history. Even the United States cannot equal that kind of power with being able to control the massive amount of trade that was there. The Edict of Milan, one of the most important things in the history, is in 313 Constantine I. Does anybody remember what the Edict of Milan did? You got to speak up. That's right. It's the worst moment in Christian history. State religion, Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire. Instantaneously, about 70 million people were Christians. In that way, a gigantic amount of growth. We haven't experienced that kind of growth, right? This is the beginning of Christianity, as Richard said, becomes legalized, if you will, to some extent. Now, that doesn't mean instantaneously everything stopped, but the 3rd century for Christians is a time of great persecution. There were not any organized Roman persecution of Christians in the 1st century or 2nd centuries. The evidence for a Domitian persecution of Christians is very late and very secondary. And so that means there's nothing about that for over 200 years after Domitian was dead. And also it's quotations of quotations. And so most of that persecution took place in the 3rd century under people like Hadrian and others. But it comes to an end with Constantine I. So the Roman Empire, very, very important. And then we have a fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476. The Eastern Roman Empire continues under Constantinople until the year 1453. So a very, very long time. The Roman Empire didn't die off for a very, very, very long time. All right, so during the New Testament period, we have Octavian. We see him, Caesar Augustus is the title used of him when Jesus was born. I believe that Jesus was born somewhere between 4 and 6 BCE because most of the evidence supports Herod the Great dying in 4 BCE. And so keep in mind there's no 0, and the concepts of BC and AD did not exist in Christianity for 500 years. That is not a New Testament thing to say that. It's one of the reasons I don't use that, because it's an inaccurate statement. Tiberius was emperor all during Jesus' ministry. We saw the coin earlier from him, so Jesus only lived on this earth under 2 different emperors. Caligula, who was a real weirdo and not really a very good person at all, he's not mentioned in the New Testament, but he's alive as we see the beginnings of the church. In the first decade or so of the church being on earth, we see Caligula, who is followed by Claudius. Now, we do see Claudius mentioned in the New Testament. And he's around, I think Paul's ministry probably started somewhere around 42, 45 in that neck of the woods, because we know Paul didn't begin his ministry immediately upon his conversion in Damascus. He went into exile, if you will, to learn for a while. And so, but we do see Claudius mentioned, for example, expelling the Jews from Rome in the book of Acts. And everybody's favorite, Nero, who some people missay he persecuted Christians throughout the empire. He did not. He did kill a bunch of Christians in Rome. That was instant. That was a very, very short and brief period of time. He did some terrible things to them, but it was not an empire-wide persecution under Nero. But Nero, not somebody you want to invite over to family dinner. Okay, a little bit of a strange bird, probably mentally insane. Some people think he killed his own mother, when in fact it's his mother that we think killed Claudius to put Nero on the throne. You don't ride away in Marine One, okay, in the ancient world. And so there we have the end of the New Testament narrative is while Paul is in prison in Rome in his first Roman imprisonment. We also have from that point on under Vespasian, I mentioned earlier, the temple was destroyed. Titus was his son. The general that did it was emperor, and then his other son, Domitian, or Domitian, however you want to pronounce his name. I put an asterisk next to their name because some interpretations of Revelation do put its writing during that time period or just prior to that time period. And then, like I said, there are some who believe in a Domitian persecution of the church, which may very well be true, but I don't believe it. All around Scripture, we also see people. We see names mentioned that are important to know. Who are procurators? Who are governors? We see Roman soldiers, centurions encountered by Jesus. If you remember, a Roman centurion who was a very, very generous patron of the Jews, who had built them a synagogue, demonstrates faith unparalleled by Jesus' fellow Jews, right? The centurion sends, now it depends on which version you read, Matthew or Luke's, he either sends servants or goes himself to tell Jesus, hey, my servant is sick. I know you really can't come in my house, and you don't need to, because I recognize that all you have to do is want him to be healed and speak, and he'll be healed. Now, how awesome is that? I mean, that's better than what you get from any of that, probably better than what you get from Jesus' disciples, right? When you think about the faith of that man and what he came to do. But it's important for us to know what is a centurion? And we think about that position. Now, a centurion generally commanded about 80 troops in a Roman century, and there were several centuries that would made up different divisions in the Roman military and added into a legion. But a centurion was a guy who commanded enough soldiers that could hear him give orders on the battlefield out loud. Keep in mind, they didn't have the over-the-ear radios and high-tech night vision goggles and all that kind of stuff. You could only direct troops by screaming at them over the cries of people whose guts were being spilled out on the battlefield. A seasoned soldier, someone who had survived long enough to make the rank of centurion, someone who had enough money to own slaves where they can be sent to him. We also see servants of Cornelius being sent in Acts chapter 10, where they're sent to that. You don't have servants if you don't have any money, okay? Just like, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand because I know only Tony has several household servants, and so I don't want to embarrass him and Pat here in just a minute, but you got to be uber wealthy to have a lot of different servants. I don't have a butler at my house, and so you're looking at the butler and cook in my house, and so you got to be wealthy. So centurions were people of means, and also this centurion built a synagogue for people. That's not a cheap thing to do at all, and so it's important that we recognize them. Then we have good old tax collectors, which are automatically synonymous with sinner, with the Jews, who they don't like. Anybody remember a famous tax collector that Jesus encounters? Yeah, we're going to sing a little song. Everybody remembers Zacchaeus, who was a wee little man. Wee little man was he. I don't make fun of Zacchaeus being a wee little man because I'm only 5'9", so I don't go around making fun of those things. But he was disliked, and tax collectors had a terrible reputation. Who's another famous tax collector that y'all looked right over? That's right, remember? He wrote a gospel, the first one. You guys just blew right by him. So Zacchaeus, yeah, he was a tax collector. Levi was, or Matthew was, and so not well liked by the Jews because, number one, they're working for the Roman government. You're essentially a traitor. Many of them were accused of being crooked and taking more than he had. Keep in mind, you're not filing your taxes online, okay? So I'm a tax collector, and this time around, Harold's going to, Dude Maddox here, he's going to bring his boat through town. He's got some fish in there. I'm going to confiscate all his fish because I know Dude makes great fish. But I'm going to tell him, hey, the tax on fish is this today. Dude's like, well, I came through yesterday, it was only this much. Too bad for you. Today is here's what it is. And then I'm going to collect that tax on you, then you're going to go sell it somewhere and I'm going to tax on you on that too. And so, dude, I'm not going to tax your fish. You bring as much as you want I'll pay myself a tax for you to bring me some fish. But tax collectors are important to recognize in what they did. And their necessity. The empire did not run itself. The soldiers, it's kind of like us today. Nobody wants to pay taxes, but you want your meat inspected and your potholes fixed. We all want services, but we don't want to pay for them. Well, the Roman government, sometimes they had to feed people. They carried on a lot of things. They had to pay soldiers. They had to pay other empires. There were trade that had to be done. Taxes were a necessary thing. And taxes have been around for about as long as we can remember. We also see people described as kings in the New Testament. King Herod Antipas, King Herod, I can't remember the name, another one. Agrippa. I was trying to think of another A. It was just dancing around. I had Archelaus in my head, all kinds of things. With the Herodian family Bush we talked about last week. And that way, king was a very, very liberal term because they were really king nothing. They simply served almost at the behest of the Roman government. But they're called kings. They're given certain territories. But eventually, Rome just gets tired of that altogether, and the Jews don't need kings. We also see things like Roman tribunes and other things along in the text. So it's very important for us to kind of understand a little bit about Roman government. So when we see a word or see a name or see some kind of position, that we know what that means. Also, Rome was divided up, much like the United States in some ways, into provinces. The letter Galatians is not to a city. It is to a province named after the Gauls who settled it there. Galatia would be how it would typically be said in that day and time, but it's a province. Judea was a province. Syria was a province that actually included Judea. Pontius Pilate served under a Roman governor that actually was from Syria. And over that way, Galilee is a little bitty geographic area. Achaia is a name for southern part of Greece. Modern-day Athens would be located in that. Macedonia would be a northern province of Greece where we see Thessaloniki and Berea and Philippi and cities. And then we see all these Caesareas. Now, people say Caesarea all the time. I don't know why people say Caesarea. Do y'all ever hear people say Caesarea? But nobody ever calls Caesar Caesar. You know, they don't pronounce it that way. But, you know, Herod the Great was one of these guys. You know how you make Caesar happy? You build cities and name them after him. You know, have Caesarea Maritima on the coast, Caesarea Philippi in the north. I'm going to build all kinds of cities named after my boy Caesar because he's going to keep me in power. And so we even see, it's kind of why there's so many Antiochs, because King Antiochus, there were several King Antiochuses of the Greeks, and so they named cities after them. Alexandria, there's several Alexandrias named after Alexander the Great. But we need to understand the concept of provinces and why was this Herod up in Galilee and this Herod was somewhere else and along those lines and thinking through it. It's just the way that they were done. There's also a judicial system, which was very, very nice in the Roman Empire. It was not something terrible. Was there bribery? Was there things go on within the Roman justice system that weren't ethical and moral? Yes, just like yours today that they go through that. But I can tell you, if you lived in the days after the fall of Rome, you greatly appreciated the Roman judicial system. Think how fairly Paul was treated. Number one, Roman citizen. That carried some weight in the judicial system. And people started beating on Paul, and they found a Roman citizen, like, oh no. All of a sudden they start treating Paul very, very carefully. You couldn't get nobody recognized your marriage if you weren't a Roman citizen. And so you get involved in the judicial system. You have one very organized judicial system. Think how fairly Paul was treated. I appeal to Caesar, which means I appeal to Caesar's court. Not everybody in the whole Roman world said, I want to talk to Caesar. And they're like, okay, you get to talk to Caesar. You know, Caesar was a busy man. And being able to go back and appeal to Caesar. But I want to be taken. He has that right. And he is taken under guard, under protective guard for that Roman judicial system to go through. Jesus wasn't mistreated by the Roman judicial system. As a matter of fact, Pilate tried to do everything he could to keep from crucifying Jesus. He was mistreated by the Jewish judicial system, if you even want to call it that. We want to understand the economy. We're going to talk about slavery in its entirely own lesson. Because if you don't understand Greco-Roman slavery, or you equate it in your mind to 18th and 19th century North American and Caribbean slavery, you misinterpret Scripture. Their slave system had a great many differences between that and the slave system that me may be familiar with. We also need to understand economy. Paul was probably on some sort of grain ship or other shipping device that was going from Egypt and stopping along the way to go to Rome. You have a system of commerce that he takes around in that way. The travels, the roadways. I can't think of a better time for that to be the case. When we think about political structure, also the religious structure, it's important for us to understand what was the religious milieu that Paul was teaching in. We sometimes don't understand why these people believed in these strange fake gods. They weren't fake to them. The deities of the Romans and the Greeks were just as real to them as your God is to you. Now we know that's not true, but they believed that just as strongly. And to tell you, the Israelites believed in phony gods that we know are phony. They believed in them very strongly too, because they prayed to the storm god Baal for it to rain, and they raised altars to him, and they put high places all over their mountains. And so if God's own people can believe in untrue gods, the Romans and Greeks can be very passionate about believing in them as well. Some key figures we have is Pilate, who is not so much a very famous governor, procurator of Judea. Festus and Felix, two individuals that Paul winds up talking to while he's in prison. They sit down, they want to understand more about what Paul has to say and teach. We talked about this in our podcast recording today a little bit. Yeah, you have to keep in mind that some people in the ancient world were more open to listening to other religions and other philosophies than we tend to be. We don't want to read anything deep and meaningful unless we got to get a grade on it, right? How many of you guys read Homer's Odyssey just on your own? You know, and looking through that, or read some of the classics on your own. And some of you guys in here are kind of nerdy, and you're like, yeah, I read it every night before I go to bed, and thinking about it. But reading about other religions, other philosophies, we think about in Athens. Remember, Paul goes up there and tells these people some pretty strange things, but some things they could agree with. Hey, they believe in gods. They believe that gods have sons. They believe that gods are responsible for creation. But the one thing that doesn't happen is people don't come back from the dead. Now, that's when they freak out a little bit. But they're at least willing to listen to that. And so Festus and Felix are that way. And then we encounter Cornelius, who is the first recorded Gentile convert to Christianity. Keep in mind that Gentiles who had proselyted into Judaism had converted to Christianity already because they were present on Pentecost. And also Cornelius is about 5 or 10 years down the road in that time. Also, even Rome and apocalyptic literature, not just Revelation, if in fact Rome is even about, Revelation is even about Rome, which I'm not sold on that, is the concept of Babylon and iron teeth. The concept that is used for Rome. If you're a Jew and you hate Rome, who do you compare them to? You compare them to the most hated city in all of Jewish history, Babylon, who destroyed the temple. And as time would tell, Rome would eventually destroy the next temple. But sometimes Babylon in apocalyptic literature is used to represent Rome. So a few things that I want us to take away from tonight's lesson. I know this was a lot of history. I promise you that does get a little bit better as we think through things and in settings. But I want to give you a broad overview and just realize that there are some basic things that it's helpful for us to understand about the historical and cultural situation that just kind of, as you read through these strange terms and these individuals' names, these provinces that Paul travels to, and we'll talk more about that in Paul's journeys, it's important that you know that. Now, you don't have to be a super duper history student or remember a whole lot of things, but just realize, okay, there's something I need to know about, something I need to understand, just to let me know how rich the biblical text is. And I'm going to tell you something else. We talked about this in the afternoon class today. We're having the afternoon classes on the Old Testament prophets. We're talking about Jeremiah today, for example. These were real people in a real world. And I think when we understand the historical context, it makes the scriptures more real to us. And it realize we're not reading about Middle Earth here and trolls and elves. We're talking about real things that we read about in our history class. And that's why I always like to tie things. You know, everybody's heard about Alexander the Great, right? He's the reason your New Testament's in Greek. Okay, so there's some important things that we can tie to that I think make it more realistic and puts it in a real world setting. Because as we read through the scriptures and we become more and more familiar with them, sometimes I think we take that out. We were talking about Jeremiah today. Jeremiah heard the cries of death in Jerusalem. He smelled the smoke and the fire burning as the temple was destroyed. He saw women looking around for their children had been killed and for their husbands that had been killed and the people screaming. He heard those things. Those are real things. Just like the screams of the drowning children and men and women at the top of the mountains when the world was flooded in Noah's day. Those were real people who died real deaths. And so it's important for us to think about that and not lose that. I think sometimes putting it in a historical context is good for people. One of the things that Jesus avoided like the plague is politics. There's no reason for Jesus to get involved in politics. Jesus' world was very confined. Jesus did not walk the whole earth. He did not have to get involved in very many things. He had enough issues to straighten out in the Jewish religious aristocracy and priesthood to worry about what the Romans were doing. Just like Paul didn't bother worrying about changing the Roman Empire, he taught Christians, how do we behave honorably within the systems that we are been given for wives, for husbands, for children, for masters, for slaves, all these household codes that were already in place. Those are not inventions in Colossians and Ephesians and Titus and 1 Peter. They are systems that already existed and say, hey, here's how you're going to behave as a Christian within those systems. There are plenty of other things to deal with and problems in the church than to get involved in that. Also, the government, Christians and the Jews before them, both endured and remained obedient despite enduring pagan overlords. I think there were a great many good Jews in Palestine during the time of Jesus. I think about people like Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea or the guys who agreed to follow Jesus. People who, and he had a lot of followers. Sometimes I think Jesus had no followers. He had a lot of followers during his time and people listening to him. Now, I think about that they were good, obedient, Torah-observing Jews in Palestine, in Corinth, in Thessaloniki, in Berea, in Rome, wherever you went, in Antioch, wherever that was, despite the fact that they were ruled over by a government who did not support that in that way. And so can you. One day, and I hope I'm alive to see it, the church is going to get a cleansing persecution in the United States. And it'll be the best thing that ever happened in the North American church. But we can be faithful no matter what's over us as far as a government, despite our fears otherwise. The Bible does say to pay taxes. Okay, I'm going to be on the internet tonight. I don't want people to say, Tim was saying that you shouldn't pay taxes, because that's not what that pericope was about Jesus. Paul takes care of that in other places and render taxes and honoring the emperor and praying for those who rule over you, which we should always do. We do have to render and give unto that. There's no reason for Christians to get into trouble. It's not going to benefit anything. Christianity was an itty bitty part of the Roman Empire for a long time, and would not take much to stamp it out if all of a sudden we start saying, hey, we Christians, we're not going to pay taxes. Christianity lasts about 10 years, if that is the case. And so we're not going to cause trouble and get into trouble doing that. Also, the circumstances that we've been talking about, when we think about the fullness of time that's described in Galatians 4:4, I will tell you as a semi-student of ancient history, there was no better time for the spread of the gospel than during the time of the Roman Empire. You had a unified world who spoke primarily two languages, Greek mostly in the eastern part and Latin in the west. You had piracy had been stomped out in the Mediterranean by Julius Caesar. You had a beautiful system of roadways, many of which last to this day. You had the ability to pass between all kinds of different countries without any issues. Paul had the ability to travel very freely. Not that it wasn't dangerous and not that it wasn't challenging, but he's able to travel just wherever he wants to. He can write letters to people in the same language, all using Greek. He doesn't have to use 4 or 5 different languages. And it is a time of the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. Rome always had conflicts. But this was a terrific time for the spread of the gospel. Writing was pretty common. And so I can't think of a better time when you had, and God knew these things, God wiser than I am. It was a terrific time for the plan to come to fruition and for the message of Jesus to be spread. It was an incredible time to do that. And so as we typically think about the Roman Empire in a very negative light, like it was all debauchery and crookedness, I want to tell you that there were a lot of good things about the Romans being in charge that blessed the spread of Christianity in the first century. And so don't always think about them negatively. You know what they call the time after Rome fell? The Dark Ages. There's a reason for that. You know, we have to go all the way to the Renaissance before people get back doing things that make sense. And so it's important for us to remember that. And so I hope you take that away from tonight. I did get a question from a class. Oh, I got to give you your homework. That's your homework. Take a picture of that. Or if you got really, really good memories, you can put that down. But only I think Steve Bradshaw's got good enough memory to remember that for a whole other week. But read that, 2 minutes before you walk into class. But feel free to send me any questions or anything you would like addressed in class. I did get an email this week from a class member, and I appreciate that very much. And I will eventually walk through an answer to that question. So feel free to email me those things. Hope you guys have a blessed rest of the week. We will see